Welcome, everyone, and thank you for gathering with the Coalition Against Gun Violence to enjoy a lovely Santa Barbara afternoon. We thought it would be raining. It did sprinkle a few moments ago, but we're glad to have brought you the sunshine. This is our 22nd annual celebration, and many of us have been gathering every year annually to support the coalition in this critically important effort of gun violence prevention. This year is different for a number of reasons, but one of them being that my family is here. My son Dan and his partner Carrie, and my son Warren and his partner Tina, and where's Ruby? Where are you, Ruby? There you are. Very special for me to have them here because they traveled a distance to get here. This year is different. Recently, our president said, "I didn't know this job would be this hard." Back in 1994, when we began this effort, we thought we knew the challenge facing us. 2017 is more challenging. Now is the time that tries our souls, to paraphrase. Other critical issues are demanding our attention and resistance, like healthcare, immigration, and the environment, just to name three. However, you are here because of your awareness and concern today and every day that 93 people will die today from gun violence, not from a disease. The Coalition Against Gun Violence, our theme this year is resist, protect California's smart gun laws. The image of the gun's muzzle tied in a knot is the giant sculpture in front of the United Nations building in New York, which exemplifies a hope for nonviolence. As I introduce the elected officials here today, we must realize the intense pressure facing these dedicated people. Their job is now more complex due to the critical issues that I mentioned. Our community is very fortunate to know our elected officials because they make themselves available to their constituency. To introduce first today, and she needs no introduction, is Lois Capps. A perennial supporter of the coalition. She authored a wonderful bill, Pause for Safety, which is similar to the gun violence restraining order that evolved from California, from Isla Vista. Congressman Salud Carbajal is stuck in Denver because of the weather, but his assistant, Chris Henson, is here to represent him. And Monique Limon, Assembly Member Monique Limon, thank you for your vote on AB 785, Disarm Hate, which is making its way through the legislature. Monique? Our Santa Barbara Mayor, Helene Schneider, member of Mayors Against Illegal Guns, City Council Member Jason Dominguez, City Council Member Greg Hart, City Council Member Kathy Murillo. I'm not sure if former Mayor Sheila Lodge is with us still. She may have left, but she was here. And the former Goleta Mayor, Margaret McConnell. And of course, our Speaker Mike Feuer and his partner, Los Angeles Superior Court Judge Gail Ruderman Feuer is with us today. We want to give special thanks to the Santa Barbara High School Jazz Band that you heard. Really? And the director, Kearney van der Sal. It's great to have the young people participate with us. And a special thanks to Joan Tudor singing Hallelujah. She's a 5th grader at Marymount. I hope that many of you were able to view Nanaki Elliott's video, Then What Is It? And as we just announced Larry Nimmer's kiosk, where you can record your personal message about gun violence. And Larry's videotaping this event. And I want to thank Marion Shapiro, who memorializes our event with her lovely photos. In your program booklet is a page, Resist Means Take Action, what you can do to reduce gun violence. The coalition's effort to engage and educate the community requires people. You can, just 2 or 3 hours in a month, you can find time to help the coalition and our community in this effort, and there's a page for sign up in the other room. After City Attorney Feuer speaks, we will hold our traditional bell ceremony, which will be led by its originators, Mary Lee and Charles Bleck. Please honor this powerful moment by remaining seated and silent. Any member of the audience who has lost a family member or friend to gun violence is welcomed and encouraged to come up and pay and say the name of their loved one and toll the bell. And now Council Member Dominguez will introduce our speaker. Oh, one more thing. Turn off your cell phone, please.
Thank you very much, Tony, for the honor to introduce our guest speaker, and thank you all so much for being here, giving up your Sunday afternoon. I'd say a lovely Sunday afternoon, even though it's raining a little bit. So it's a great pleasure to introduce the City Attorney of LA, Mike Feuer. Please note in the program there's a 2-page bio, and I want to point out one thing that's not on his bio because it's very important. He was Executive Director of BetZedek, which is one of the best public interest law providers, not only in California, but I think across the country. And I work on the ABA's pro bono committee, and so I go out and actually audit different nonprofits that do legal work. And I ran Santa Barbara's Legal Aid Foundation and worked for California Rural Legal Assistance. And I know how hard it is to do public agency law work. And so he's gone through city service both as a elected city council member. He was an assembly member, and one of the things that talks about in his bio is his great work with the microstamping bill, and then ran against an incumbent and won in LA as the city attorney. So he's been doing great work as a prosecutor. So with no further ado, let me bring up Mike. Thank you so much for being here.
Oops, thank you. Gonna get organized here. Very good. Hey, Jason, thanks very much. That was very kind. It is wonderful to be here. It was supposed to rain, but it's beautiful. That's a sign, I think, to all of us. So what I'm going to do, I think, is this reverberating a little bit? Are we okay? What do you think I should do?
I think we're
all right? Good. What I'd like to do is to speak with you. I was asked to speak for maybe 15 minutes or so. Maybe I'll do this. What if I
tilt this a little bit.
Is this any better if I do it from here?
Yes.
Okay, good. Perfect. Thanks very much. So what I'm going to do is to speak for maybe 10, 15 minutes, and then we'll have more of a conversation among us. So I'm going to stand, I think, over here. It'll be better. So gun violence issues are very personal issues, I think, to each of us. I know a number of people who are here, many of whose lives have been touched forever by gun violence. I haven't had such a scarring experience, but I have had experience with this issue. I was in Washington just a few days ago. We'll talk more about that with the Blecks and others. And I want to share an anecdote that I did with a couple of the national organizations. Back in 1999, I was a city council member, and the North Valley Jewish Community Center shooting took place. Everybody remember what that was? I see Congresswoman Capps shaking her head. Yeah, that was a moment when a white supremacist, a racist, and an anti-Semite had gone to a Jewish community center. He had gunned down a Filipino-American postal worker, and then he set his sights on the kids and some of the adults at the Jewish community center. I was on the city council. It was the summertime. Our own kids were enrolled in other Jewish community center programs elsewhere in Los Angeles. We didn't know how pervasive the problem was. We got the word about the shootings. I made sure that our own children were safe. And then I raced out to the scene. Went past the police tape and found that a young boy, 5 years old, the same age as our daughter Danielle was at that moment, had been shot and rushed to the hospital. One of the things about being an elected official in moments like this is that there's no script for that. You know, you don't do a press conference at that moment. I decided to go to the hospital, and I sat in a tiny waiting room with this young boy's parents to wait to learn if he would survive, which he did. I'll tell you an interesting side note, by the way. So this was 1999. I was running for the job I now hold, maybe 4.5 years ago, and there was a small group gathering in the Los Angeles area, and I told this story. The host in the room stood up in her living room, and she said, "You won't believe it, but those parents are here." And I made renewed contact with people I hadn't seen for 15 years, and their son is now thriving. It was a wonderful thing to see. Each of us has had some experience that brings us here today. The question is, what are we going to do next? And that's the point that I want to continue to bring home as I share a few thoughts with you this afternoon. I'm the city attorney, as was mentioned, on the city council. When that event took place, I'd already begun to take steps on gun violence prevention, but that moment was a real catalyst for me. And I'm now the author of most of Los Angeles' toughest laws to prevent gun violence. And then it's always good to have one person do that, then people feel compelled to join in. But then I went to the state legislature, and I was able to work with key organizations throughout California and write a couple of California's most innovative laws to tackle gun violence. And now in the city attorney's role, I have the opportunity to try to assure that we're effectuating those laws, to enforce laws that I helped to write in the first place, but take things to a whole new level. And let me tell you what I mean by this, because I want in this presentation to suggest to you other steps that you might want to help promote here and elsewhere through friends and relatives and jurisdictions throughout the United States. So as city attorney, I created a gun violence prevention unit. One of the first steps we took was to take an existing law. There's a prohibition in California on domestic abusers who are the subjects of temporary restraining orders holding weapons. But we found there was no system in place in Los Angeles to effectuate that rule. Why does that matter? Because those of you who have been involved in domestic violence issues know that the spouse, typically the woman, the partner in that situation, is 500% more likely to die at the hands of gun violence situations, if their partner has a weapon than if not. So that weapon has to be taken out of the equation. It's one of the most dangerous calls that a police officer gets, is to go to a scene of domestic abuse. So we now have a system in Los Angeles, and I can tell you domestic abusers in our jurisdiction don't have guns anymore. So what else did we do? We began to look at enforcement issues. As Jason mentioned, I have many roles. We write all the laws in the city in my office, we promote civil litigation, we defend the city, we sue on behalf of the people of the state, and we prosecute. On that prosecutorial side, I've taken steps like have our office go after adults when kids bring guns to school. And here is a precise example. There was a 9-year-old boy who was carrying a semi-automatic weapon through the halls of his elementary school in the San Fernando Valley. That adult shouldn't have a weapon, and that adult does not now. Another example, there was a high school student, a young woman who was very brave because she reported the following situation to adults at the school. A friend of hers had had an altercation with another guy the day before on campus. And then the guy with the altercation had reported to this young woman that he was really angry about that. and that he had a gun in his backpack. She told adults, and there was a series of quick interventions both there and at his house. And that was a situation where the mom had stored a gun like in the counter above, a cabinet above the kitchen counter, for instance. So what do we do with these prosecutions? They are not merely moments to try to impose new restrictions on the individual who allowed the gun to get out of their sight. There are moments to educate the public. And we joined with Women Against Gun Violence, one of your colleague organizations in Los Angeles, to have then a series of conversations with parents at schools throughout Los Angeles about how we can work together to get the word out about the importance of storing weapons safely. One of my themes as city attorney is we seek to enact laws, we effectuate those laws, we enforce those laws, but that public education piece is a role that all of us can play and is really important. Speaking of that gun violence restraining order legislation, which again emerged, as many of you know, from an incident in Isla Vista, which was a preventable incident when, a series of people got shot, when there were warning signs after warning signs. This young man was known to his family to be, at that moment at least, a danger to himself and others, and no one did anything about it. And then he, unfortunately, used a weapon and gunned down a series of people. Well, that incident became the catalyst for a state law. There are only a couple or three in the United States where states have in place laws that enable members of families or law enforcement to go to a court and get a temporary order dispossessing that person of their weapon just at a time when we think that they are at their most dangerous. That's a key theme for me. Using the science of risk is a key theme for me. I'll return to that in just one moment. But in our office, we've conducted trainings for lawyers around California and members of their families for how to make sure if they want to bring one of these actions to get a temporary restraining order, to get the gun out of someone's hands, they know how to do that. But now we work in California, we work here in Santa Barbara. Joyce Dudley is the DA. You have a marvelous district attorney here. I'm very pleased to work with her. But I learned something that I want to share with you too, just to kind of promote some thinking on your part, from my role as a state legislator. In Sacramento, as must be true, Lois, in Congress, for every bill, there's a piece of paper that your caucus gives you, Democrats or Republicans, before each bill. It says what the bill is, what it does, who's for it, who's against it, and what your caucus says you should do, vote yes or no on the bill. Well, I noticed early on, there were certain organizations on that support or oppose list that would really resonate with a Democrat or a Republican. If the Sierra Club was in favor of a bill, Democrats were inclined to support it. If the Chamber of Commerce was in favor of a bill, Republicans might be inclined to support it. But prosecutors were uniquely credible on both sides of the aisle. Why? Because I think people view us as having real experience in law enforcement, and everybody wants to have their jurisdiction be safe. Knowing that everyone, Republican and Democrat alike, cares what prosecutors think about legislation, among other issues, led me, when I became state attorney, to reach out to the district attorney of Manhattan, Cyrus Vance Jr., who I'd met once, and say, why don't we form the first ever coalition in the history of the United States of prosecutors to prevent gun violence, so that everybody would listen to that voice. And I will say, it took us a very short time, about 2.5 years ago, to form this group, and Prosecutors Against Gun Violence has now had 5 national summits. We have members from the North, East, South, Midwest, Republicans, and Democrats. And here are some things that we have done. In that prosecutorial role, we've collaborated with a group called the Coalition for Risk-Based Firearms Policy. I was interviewed before this gathering today and asked, how do you find, I'm going to paraphrase the question, how do you find common ground with those who are Second Amendment proponents? There should be common ground. And I think that common ground could be around the science of risk. Because we know that data tells us, not sloganeering, not some politician saying X or Y, the science tells us that someone who's committed violent misdemeanors is much more likely to commit an act of gun violence, shouldn't have a gun. That someone, I mentioned earlier, who's a domestic abuser is so much more likely to injure somebody in the heat of that moment and thereafter, they shouldn't have a weapon for a while. Someone who is temporarily mentally unstable shouldn't have a gun at that moment. And yet under federal law, all those people can have guns. So what do we do about that? we combine with scientists and others and say, why don't prosecutors and law enforcement and scientists go to members of Congress on both sides of the aisle and say we can do better? And here are some particular laws that we can pass. So our prosecutors group is now working with a parallel group called State Legislators for Gun Violence Prevention. We just held a press conference after our most recent summit in New York with them. And this is a model that was one of my aspirations when we first thought of this program. There are 20 jurisdictions now with legislators from their group across the United States seeking to put in place what they call extreme risk protective orders. That's the synonym for the gun violence restraining order here. In 20 places around the country, at that press conference were legislators from Alabama and Michigan. Think about that for a second. And we're going to match prosecutors from our organization and uniformed police and others with those legislators to present a pretty muscular coalition that should transcend politics to try to make changes in those states around the nation. I mentioned domestic violence. Our group and the Coalition for Risk-Based Firearms Policy produced a blueprint, a template for how every jurisdiction in the country could get guns out of the hands of domestic abusers. President Obama thought it was so important, the White House tweeted the report. And then we were asked to speak. I spoke at the White House before governors and mayors and state lawmakers around the United States about how in the absence of meaningful action at the congressional level, we could take action at this level. So, a lot to do. Let's now conclude this, and I'll take some questions with this. As I mentioned, I was in Washington last week on Capitol Hill, meeting with senators and members of Congress, on both sides of the aisle, by the way, on a variety of issues. You might know that our office brought the very now famous Wells Fargo litigation, so I was talking about consumer protection while I was there, and talking about gun violence. And on the gun violence side of the ledger, we were talking about a particularly dangerous pending federal law. There's a proposal, and it's seen the light of day more than once, but now there's an opportunity, unfortunately, with a new president in place for this to actually come to the finish line. It'd be horrible. It's a piece of legislation that you're aware of. It's called Concealed Weapons Carry Reciprocity. A lot of fancy words in this. Well, here's what it means. It means that if I am allowed to carry a concealed weapon in any state in the nation, every other state has to recognize that permit. And let's talk about why that's so dangerous. There are 12 states in the United States where you don't even need a permit to carry a weapon in a concealed fashion. Arizona is one of them, on our border. Interestingly, when Vance and I did this press conference with others in New York about a month ago or so, New York is bordered by Vermont. Same problem. Almost anybody can have a concealed weapon with no evidence of it, no permit to signify it. In Vermont, same thing is true in Arizona. So what does this mean for law enforcement? If you're a police officer in Times Square or in downtown Los Angeles or here in Santa Barbara, how are you supposed to know when you stop somebody who has a concealed weapon whether they're lawfully carrying it or not? Think about the implications for terrorism. It's a horrible idea, but there are 35 senators who are co-sponsors of Senator Cornine's bill right now. Without naming names, we met with one of those senators, and I'm optimistic that may change. We have a voice. We need to use it. Tony referred to President Trump and the NRA. You all know that he referred to what he felt was the debt that he owes to the NRA for being in office, a debt that he expressed just last week. That requires vigilance on our part. It requires more than that. We need to be identifying a role that each of us can play. Now, in California, it's kind of a unique situation because we're preaching to the choir, most of us here in California. But you have to be able to amplify that voice, California's voice, in the legislature and coalesce. Charlie and Mary Lee were in Washington last week with advocates from the Brady campaign and chapters across the United States, with members from Americans for Responsible Solutions coming together for one of these national summits of grassroots people like yourselves who are deciding, well, is this a defining moment for me? And let me conclude with this. I began with the personal, let me end with the personal, but it's not my story. When we were there last week, one of the segments at this conference was a segment about how we changed the message, and it featured some documentarians who had just produced recent, very moving movies about Sandy Hook, about events at a mass shooting in Oregon. One of the panelists was a young woman about the age of our son now, probably in her mid-20s, describing the fact that when there was a mass shooting in Oregon, in Roseville not long ago, the news was, fortunately, only 2 people were killed in that shooting. One of those people was her mother. And she, in a very poignant way, described, it was hard for her, I could tell, that she needed to be at that summit to give her mother's life meaning. Far be it from me to put myself in her position. I can't know what she feels right now. But she had the courage to work through her grief and be there in a fairly gut-wrenching presentation to describe what giving her mother's life meaning meant by expressing it in practical terms. What are we going to do? Any questions for me? Yes.
I'm a historian, and when I look at the Second Amendment, I wonder why we don't understand it this way. The right of the people to keep and bear flintlock muskets shall not be infringed. What am I missing?
I think very little. I am a little concerned that you might have a flintlock musket in your closet someplace, but other than that, no, I think that those who call themselves Supreme Court justices who are strict constructionalists tend to view the world as though there's something magical about their ability to step into the shoes of the framers of the Constitution and identify what they must have meant. That is not conservatism, on my view. That is activism, on my view. And parenthetically, maybe there's a role for activism, interpretation. This is a living document, the Constitution. There's no way that the framers would have predicted what it's like to have the pervasive number of weapons that are on the streets of Los Angeles right now. No one would have known what gang violence looked like in those days. If you really want to be a strict constructionalist, of course, you attribute to the framers, I mean, everybody knows that they had slaves, for example. No one thinks that that ought to remain the rule today. So no, I think that there is room, however, for that common ground that has been so elusive. If we build on some of the lessons, even of the Heller decision, which had some bad elements to it, but at least it's noted that there are a number of restrictions that are permissible to put in place. Even a conservative Supreme Court said it's permissible to have a number of restrictions on the use of guns right now. I just hope we don't move farther and farther away from the common sense rules that make California one of the safest places in the country. And the thing I do want to say about that, by the way, there's a direct correlation between those jurisdictions that have common sense gun rules and the most formidable ones and those jurisdictions that have seen the steepest declines in gun violence. Now, those scientists are unable to say there's cause and effect, but there is a very deep correlation there that all of us should take note of. Other questions? Yeah, Charlie.
I'm interested in the feedback you had when you're talking to the federal legislators, especially on the carry conceal bill and federalism, and the idea that the NRA wants to tell us, well, it's like driver's licenses, yet when we did driver's licenses, it was a state agreement, not a federal mandate. And if we really respect the 10th Amendment and states' rights to have our own particular well-being, what kind of a feedback did you get if that came up in your discussions?
Well, how could it not come up? Because that, of course, if you've been in the room, I would have been channeling Charlie in doing that. That, of course, is exactly the thing to say. And with 2 senators, one on each side of the aisle, I made that very point. And I've made it to a couple others since that time. If there, of course, consistency is lost on people these days, right? But if one is an advocate for states' rights, one of the most anti-states' rights pieces of legislation you could imagine is one that seeks to impose on one state another state's rules. If you're really thinking that local control matters a lot, and that is a key Republican theme, then you should say we hate this bill. Because this bill is undermining those who run California's legislature or Wyoming's or Texas's, because it says to them, you don't know best what keeps your residents safe. We think that Vermont knows best or Arizona knows best for you. And their feedback and response was that it resonated. That argument resonated with people. Now, again, it resonated in small meetings. We'll see what happens on the floor. But I was given some reason for optimism based on these early conversations. I think that once the full scope of a rule like this is revealed to very busy legislators thinking about a lot of things. When their vote is on the line, I hope they think seriously about it. And we're just beginning this. And you should be writing letters to the editor and opinion pieces and working with other friends and neighbors of yours in other states to do the same thing. Yeah.
Question. If concealed weapons, you can carry concealed weapons freely, let's say, how many weapons can you conceal? In other words, if you drive across, particularly in relation to the sport, you drive from Arizona into California in a van, and it's locked, but it's full of weapons, are those concealed weapons?
Yeah, so I don't know if typically concealed weapons are those concealed on your person. Don't get too creative on us, please. I don't know what a court would say about that. I would say it's concealed on your person in public is the rule. But let me just amplify that point for just for 1 minute. You know, I have worked on these issues for a long time, and I travel elsewhere, and I speak and so forth. Dallas is a great example. In Dallas, there are fairly liberal concealed carry rules. A lot of people can carry them there. Parenthetically, even they have tighter restrictions than, say, Arizona does, and why they'd want to impose Arizona's lesser restrictions on Texans, I don't get. But if these rules make you so much safer, why is it that you will see in downtown Texas in permanent, not temporary placards embedded in the walls of institutions like the hotel I was staying in, please keep your weapon outside? Right? Just saying. Time for, I think, a last question or two. Yeah. Well, now there are a whole bunch. You tell me, Tony, when to stop. Go ahead.
What role do you think the munitions industry has in all of this legislation?
Huge. Question was, what role does the munitions industry play? By the way, I think that means gun manufacturers, not just ammunition manufacturers. Because, by the way, another horizon that California is now reaching is on ammunition restrictions. When I was on the city council back in the 1990s, I proposed legislation in Los Angeles that would require a permit for someone who wanted to purchase ammunition. And the purpose of that idea was, if you can't have a gun, you shouldn't be able to buy a bullet either. The technology wasn't robust enough. The internet was in its very nascent stages, and we couldn't technically get it done. But you just voted for it. So now in California, through Prop 63, that's going to be the rule. The gun manufacturers and others are so tightly connected to opponents of these measures and so deeply involved in legislation and litigation. It's appalling to me, I have to say. And so that implies things. It implies, for example, that it would be good if jurisdictions that purchase weapons could put restrictions on those entities that are purporting to sell them. Yeah, you want to sell guns to LAPD? Here are some restrictions on what you can do. Now, I would like to see that happen. I've advocated for that for about 15 years. It hasn't been the rule yet. But I do think that responsible gun manufacturers shouldn't be an oxymoron. And many of you know, one of the most insidious pieces of federal legislation that I can remember came in the wake of lawsuits that had germinated across the United States. Jurisdictions, including Los Angeles, back in 2000, 2001, sued the gun manufacturers. So what did Congress do? Passed a law, you can't do that anymore. And I'm oversimplifying, but not by a lot. We need to get that back. It's not going to happen in this Congress or with this president. But think about it for a second. Why should gun makers uniquely be insulated from being on the wrong side of a lawsuit? It's appalling. There are some things one might be able to do. I'm looking at some creative avenues now to circumvent those rules. That's a real problem. Yes, other questions? Yeah.
I saw in Morris Dees, you know, the
Yes.
property law people, a map of the United States with each state, the number of hate groups that they know exist. And I saw that California had 160-something, and I looked at all the other states, just glanced, skimmed. It was the highest one I could find, even more than New York or other places.
Right.
And I'm just wondering, how does this hate group
Right.
amazingly high number fit with gun?
So it's a big issue. And so let's bring things back, since we're in Santa Barbara, to what Jason really cares about. And that's Jason for a moment here. Let me just say, so Jason, when he was a deputy city attorney, he tells me, was part of a unit that still exists. And let me describe the work of the unit, because I want you to be talking to people here and elsewhere about doing the same thing. So the unit is a citywide nuisance abatement team. Nuisance is a very sterile sounding term. So I've been trying in our office to make that team very robust. Here's what it does when it comes to guns, and I'm going to get back to hate crimes. What it does is I send teams of our lawyers, very brave people frequently, into communities where a house is the or an apartment building is the source of guns and drugs and gang activity in a neighborhood. And let's be real about this. when I go to visit these scenes, as I do, the police give me a bulletproof vest. The kids who live there don't have that luxury. So, and let me just, again, very directly, I was in a neighborhood in Watts in South Los Angeles where a bunch of single-family homes, the purchasers of which are on their way up. They just got a house. Walking down that street, all fenced off, fence, 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 bullet hole, bullet hole, bullet hole. In what is now kind of a cliche, and it's astonishing that it can be that, a police officer walked me down the street, pointed to a house and said, you know that daddy who lives there? He doesn't let his kids sleep in beds. Why? Anybody know why? Because a bed is above the windowsill and a stray bullet could hit his kid. This is in, same thing. This is in contemporary Los Angeles, right? So we went in to that area and targeted this house. And I can tell you kids are walking to school now, safely. There's a high school in Los Angeles, very famous high school called Locke High School. Locke High School, a lot of athletes in professional ball come from Locke. So Avalon, this is my visual aid, I don't do a lot of PowerPoints. So this is Avalon, which is a major street there. Here is Locke High School. Here's a building, apartment building, multiple units across the street. The fence here separates the athletic fields from the sidewalk. That fence at Locke High School is reinforced to repel bullets. You send your kid to a school whose fence has to be reinforced to repel bullets. So across the street, Jason would know this kind of activity well, is a multi-unit apartment building. I went there. I saw the guys sitting on folding chairs like this, you know. They're sentinels because rock cocaine is being sold there, lots of gun violence there. And so what do? We use civil litigation, not prosecutions. We sue the owners of these properties. In that case, some guy in Irvine who owned the property. Irvine, you know, not too far away, but remote from this. And not only did we demand that the conditions change in multiple ways, but we said to a court, if he will not change the conditions in this property, make him live there. Let him know what it feels like to have bullets whiz by his head. Parenthetically, surprising how quickly the conditions changed at that location, right? So, one of our most recent activities, I'm very proud, our office just won actually an award from the Anti-Defamation League for this. White supremacists in the San Fernando Valley, right now, empowered more than have been recently. The national conversation empowers these groups. We went after them. Shut down in single-family neighborhoods, locations that had been hotbeds of what we allege was criminal activity and other kinds of what you would consider very dangerous ideology, to put it gently. I'm concerned about the proliferation of skinhead-type groups, those tied to the Aryan Brotherhood. These white supremacist groups are an issue. And putting weapons and them together is a truly lethal combination. Offices like mine are going after them. I would like to see that work modeled in jurisdiction after jurisdiction up and down the state. Yes?
Yeah, AB 785, hate crime, pulling out a gun for 10 years. That's in our legislature right now.
Oh, terrific. I don't actually know that bill, so I don't, because Charlie knows. They're just showing off now. Yeah. Go ahead.
785.
I got it now. Yeah, go ahead.
Well,
I'm
so you
sorry.
get rid of them, where do they go? I mean, are you arresting them, are you changing them, are you doing something?
One of the things that happens when we go into neighborhoods in these contexts is when people concentrate in a given location, they're particularly dangerous. When they disperse, much less so. Now, I can't say for sure what happens when we disperse people who are concentrated in these buildings. I do know, as an actuarial matter, that the area gets safer when this happens. And we can't conduct like a longitudinal study to say, to follow each person and see where they go. But I'm quite certain that this is a very appropriate and important approach to take. Parenthetically, because the work that we do, including on that white supremacist work, targets buildings that typically are near sensitive sites, schools, playgrounds, daycare centers, other types of locations where I'll be darned if we're going to allow people to have weapons close to those locations. We have a neighborhood school safety program that's designed to get guns away from everybody in a radius around that school who might have ever touched anything that has to do with violence. Yeah.
Out of curiosity, is there any common ground with the NRA? Or, because it seems like every time I hear something about them,
Yeah.
it's just a wall, it's no.
So because I am unduly idealistic, I'm trying to find that common ground. Our prosecutors group, for example, I mentioned, has held multiple summits. We held a summit in Miami a couple years ago. The topic was the connections between mental illness and gun violence. We invited the past president of the NRA, who is now the editorial page editor, I think, for the Washington Times, to come speak. Still very important in the NRA, still on his board, I think. And he came. And we engaged with him. In fact, on issues about trying to find this common ground on what I call the risk-based approach to this, thinking that, and there was a screen at this summit where the Coalition for Risk-Based Firearms Policy had delineated a series of people, like I did now, who, at least temporarily, ought to be dispossessed of their weapons. And I asked, David Keene is the guy's name, I asked him at that summit, can't we find common ground around these issues? Because some of what he was saying seemed to resonate. No firm commitments, and nothing has evolved from that at this point, I have to say. But I think by rights there should be some common ground, except now that Mr. President Trump is our leader, I think that the NRA feels particularly emboldened now. Under Obama, I thought maybe there was a heightened opportunity because he was the backstop, and therefore any really insidious legislation wasn't going to be signed into law. So let's recognize we could have a stalemate, or we could actually try to find some common ground. Now I'm concerned they're feeling their oats a little bit. So this is, to me, a particularly dangerous moment. And what happens on that concealed carry legislation in the U.S. Senate will, I think, define what this next period of time looks like. If that bill stops, it would send a message that you can't get everything you want. You can't run the table right now. If the bill moves forward, it will be an incredibly empowering message to them about what's next. So, okay, yes?
So you mentioned Prop 63.
Yeah.
I'm aware that there are groups looking to bring litigation challenging specifically the ban on high-capacity magazines.
Right.
What do you think of the likelihood of those litigation success? And is your group, Prosecutors Against Gun Violence, or your office doing anything with respect to helping in that litigation?
We may end up helping. A prosecutors group is not involved in that, but my office might be involved in helping. We are not a litigant per se. We might be a friend of the court, for example, as those cases make their way up the chain. I want to share with the group here, the NRA has been very clear. They waited to bring these challenges until they saw if Gorsuch was going to be approved as a U.S. Supreme Court justice. Now they think they have a moment, and they're trying to test the moment. There are 5 lawsuits that they intend to bring. They've just brought a couple so far, but the others are on the way, challenging key ingredients in California's very robust gun violence prevention legislative package. Whether it's high-capacity magazines, interpretations of assault weapons and bullet buttons and so on, that's what they started with, or other measures down the road. And that's going to require, I think, all of us working together to defend those laws. I hate playing defense. One of the things that my wife will tell you is that one of the things that's frustrating about my job is I get to define offense, suing Wells Fargo, doing this kind of stuff, but also anytime the city of LA is sued, we have to defend the city. That's our job. And so frequently someone else has defined the agenda for us. We have to act as someone has sued us. That's not my speed. So I keep trying to find ways to turn those losses into something positive for the city, even when it looks very negative at first. And in this setting, I don't like playing defense. I don't like reacting to the concealed carry thing and so on, but it is what it is. And I think while we play offense at the state level, and we can continue to do that in state after state, right now it's a defensive moment at the federal level. On this litigation, though, I think that each of the challenges, I think, will be turned aside, at least until the U.S. Supreme Court. But I'm optimistic even there. We'll see what happens. See how long Justice Kennedy stays on the court. That's a very important thing, by the way, too. Yeah, Tony.
Didn't the city of Los Angeles pass a resolution about HR 38 in opposition to concealed carry?
Yeah.
Is that effective?
So Tony's question is it effective for city councils like the one in Los Angeles to pass resolutions that oppose or support particular federal legislation? It can only help to do that. I don't think it is definitive in what it does. It's not going to define the outcome. But one of the things that having a city council or a state legislature pass such a resolution does is that it empowers lobbyists for those jurisdictions to be active in Washington where before they couldn't be. And I think this is a moment where lobbying is a very good thing. Hey, Das, how are you? Nice to see you. You know, one of the things we have to get over as advocates at a grassroots level is something I saw for years when I was writing these laws. The NRA, beautifully organized, very active. I remember being acutely frustrated. I would write a law on gun violence prevention, and the next day in the LA Times would be letters to the editor saying what a jerk I was for having passed that law in the first place. But our side wasn't saying what a great idea it was. We cannot be out-organized. We can't have the activism emanate only from others. And so I'm a fan of activism at every level. I'm a fan of tenacity too, because sometimes in California we get kind of complacent about this kind of stuff because we think that the legislature will be an effective backstop and they stand with us, and the majority of legislators tend to do that. That complacency cannot be even allowed to enter the room right now, because not to take this into entirely different directions, you know, Tony's mentioning the moment that we're in nationally. You know, I went to LAX to try to get the detainees released from custody in the wake of the travel ban. I did that because I felt at that moment that part of our country was on the verge of slipping away. That is not true only with respect to the constitutional rights that were at stake in those travel ban orders. That's true here too. We're passive, we're complacent, then we deserve what we get. We're active, we're engaged, we're empowered, whole different nation. So listen, for today, although Tony encouraged it, this is way past my time here. So I know you have a lot more to do this afternoon, but I really honor the fact that on what turned out to be a lovely afternoon, you chose to be here rather than someplace else. It means that here in Santa Barbara, there's an active core of leaders who are prepared to coalesce around this issue and take action. I think that's marvelous. Some people traveled from Orange County to be here. That's exceptional. Let's choose to use this moment to define the value of our own lives in ways maybe we never have before. That's what it means, I think, to be a citizen now. This is a defining thing for each of us individually, and your group is an example of what it means to be a catalyst for the kinds of change that will make our country safer. Thank you very much. Excuse me, I'm going to head for our next adventure. Have a great rest of the event.
Thank you, Mike. That was marvelous. I want to encourage the people here to understand that some of the things that Mike Feuer is talking about, which is how parents need to, you see this sign? We have a flyer that we would like to send out to the schools that tell parents it's the law that you need to lock your weapon. We need to keep our children safe. And we haven't been very successful at doing that. Anybody who has any ideas of how we can get this information to parents in Santa Barbara County, I'd be glad to hear that. Also, is Kelly Scott still here? Kelly knows a lot about this gun violence restraining order. She was on our show, and then Das, this is your bill. And if you want to know more about this, how to do it, what's it about, we have flyers sitting on the table. The Coalition Against Gun Violence is an educational organization, and that's what we have that information for. I hope that many of you will remain for a little while, because after our ceremony we do have some goodies still out there. I want to thank the Santa Barbara Club. They have delicious food and a wonderful staff. There's coffee and cookies and goodies still out there for you. In your in your program, we talk about something that we call the bell ceremony. And I want to ask Mary Lee and Charles Bleck to come up here and explain what the ceremony is about.
Thank you, Tony. As you all know, the bell has been a symbol throughout history for great events that happen. We ring the bell in times of celebration, weddings, coronations. We ring the bell in alarm. But today we are going to be ringing the bell in honor and memory of those who have been lost to gun violence. In many gun violence prevention gatherings throughout the United States, and even some outside of the United States, where this issue is carried forward, it is also rung. And if you have a loved one or a friend or want to mark an occasion of a mass shooting, I encourage you to come forward one at a time as we all remain silent and ring the bell for your loved one. And if you're willing to do so, mention the name, the age, and the circumstance of the shooting. Charlie, would you begin?
Yes. For our son Matthew Black, age 21, victim of an attempted robbery.
For the victims of the Elliot Rogers shooting in Isla Vista.
For brother warriors, all the vets.
Michael Jason Spradling, 25, murdered. For 6 people murdered at the post office in Goleta in 2007, I think it was.
For Dr. Hahn, his wife, and 5-year-old daughter.
For the 26 lives lost at Sandy Hook.
For my brother Michael Patrick, who died in 2004, and his son, who learned how to resolve conflict, who both died from gun violence.
Here, ring the bell.
Who learned how not to resolve conflict.
I would like to ring the bell, toll the bell, for the 33,000 people who have died in a year in America.
For my best friend's daughter, Katie Potter, who was a police officer and killed herself with a gun.
Thank you all for sharing your stories.
Each of these individuals who are lost belongs to our family, the human family. We feel their loss with grief and passion. This is not merely about the prevention of gun violence. This is about recognizing a culture of violence and that violence touches us all. I want to invite Jotzi, where are you?
Hello, everyone. My name is Jitsibe Sandoval, and on behalf of the Coalition Against Gun Violence, thank you for coming and participating in our 22nd annual event. Our next event in Santa Barbara is the Santa Barbara Gun Buyback on June 10th. We encourage you to stay current through our e-list for action alerts, our website, and social media. Before you leave, be sure to collect your silent auction items. Final word for the year: resist. Resist.
So please go into the silent auction. It's still open, and there are goodies. If any